I'm speaking in good faith today with David W. Peters. He served as an enlisted Marine and Army chaplain and deployed to Iraq in 2005. David, thank you for being with us today.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you.
David is the author of several books, notably Death Letter, God, Sex, and War, and Post-Traumatic God, How the Church Cares for People Who Have Been to Hell and Back. Interesting subject matter that we're going to delve in today. And today he serves as the vicar of St. Joan of Arc Episcopal Church, that's in a suburb of Austin, Texas, which is a new church plant in the Diocese of Texas. And when I hear Diocese of Texas, David, I mentioned before we started, Texas is as big as many European countries. That's a big area.
There are 5 dioceses of Texas in the Episcopal Church. We were just the first, so we got to claim the Texas. There's West Texas, North Texas, but we got Texas because we were first. That's the joke.
So the name of the book I want to dig into with you today is Post-Traumatic Jesus, A Healing Gospel for the Wounded. And it seems like maybe we should say, what is trauma? And you give this very interesting definition really in the beginning of the introduction. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes. I think the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan the last 20 plus years have served as a way to illustrate trauma and PTSD for a wider audience. I think most people before 2001 wouldn't have known what PTSD stood for or what it was, but just the preponderance of articles, both positive and negative and everywhere in between, has really shown this subject in a broader light for war veterans, combat veterans. It's pretty easy to see trauma and those sorts of experiences, the wound. Trauma is the Greek word for wound. And there's a lot of words for wound in Greek, like there are in English. In every language has a lot of words for cuts, scrapes, bruises, you name it, because that's something that happens universally to human beings. And so in the literature of the last 20 plus years, there's been a lot of focus on combat trauma and what that does to people. And that has provided a vehicle to understand trauma on a much deeper level in the wider population that haven't participated directly in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and America. And most notably sexual assault, predominantly against women in our communities, has been a place an unexpected place of profound trauma and need for understanding, as those two populations of the combat veteran, predominantly male, especially around the time of the Vietnam War and coming home from that, and then this other group of victims that had PTSD and trauma-related issues of people that have survived sexual assault, and the research and diagnosis of PTSD came out of these two populations. So today, I think people are more aware of trauma. We live in a much more trauma-informed community and society, but it really just means wound, and it's different than just a physical wound on the surface of our skin or that pierces our skin, but also an emotional and spiritual wound that changes the nature of who we are, especially in the area of trust. Good.
Well, you mentioned that trauma reorganizes our brain. In a way that can make us feel like it's ongoing, even if it's a past event, which is psychologically really interesting and difficult.
And that's why it's a problem for living today. That's why there's counselors that specialize in trauma, because people who have been through traumatic events are reliving the experience in times and places that aren't traumatic. When the smallest, slightest thing happens in our lives, whether it's a traffic, slowdown or some other experience that just causes a minor degree of stress normally, and suddenly we're triggered like a gun. The trigger is pulled and the explosion happens, where we, in our minds, relive the physical and mental and emotional and spiritual experiences of the original traumatic event. And that makes relationships really hard if you're always kind of feeling there's a threat that's out to get us. That is really hard to live in trust and community. And that's why it's a problem for everyday living. That's why we devote huge amount of resources to try to help people heal from these kinds of wounds.
You've done something really interesting, which is to project back. And as much as I have read in the New Testament some very violent episodes, picturing Mary there at the foot of the cross with the other women and the apostles there during the hours that Jesus was being crucified and dying, we forget sometimes, because she is so honored, that she lived with that trauma for the rest of her life and how that might have informed. Anyway, I think it ties into all of us. So this is, to me, the spiritual connection that I would love you to make for us, that for Christians, we have a post-traumatic Jesus, someone who has lived through some ultimate pain. Am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for all of us that grow up in church, or maybe not in church, but hear stories about Jesus, the crucifixion is sort of the thing that people do know about Jesus, that he died that way, and that it was painful in that way. And then there's the sort of the spiritual theological reflections on crucifixion that we might hear as a kid, that Jesus died for our sins according to the scriptures, as Paul says in the New Testament. But those two things don't always come together. The sheer physical pain of being crucified, which is a Roman torture method, that, there probably are more painful ways to die, but I can't think of any. And it's the length of time it takes and all those other things. And then this other spiritual, theological things that are happening that Christians have always known, even in the gospel accounts, even though they don't go into long theological explanations of what is happening there on the cross. They just kind of describe it as they see it. They know something bigger is happening in the universe with God and with us. And so I think I've been trying to bring these two things together for all of us, and that's what we have to do with our own trauma too. The events in our lives that turned our world upside down, that we look back maybe 20 or 10 years later and say, oh, that was a turning point when I lost that person in my life, or that car wreck happened, or that war, or that assault, or that situation. And it can be a wide variety of things. There's a lot of things that get to us in the inner part of our soul that turns it upside down, says, I'm not safe anymore. I can't trust anybody anymore. And when you look at that and say, where was God when that happened? Where is God now after that happened? Could God really be a loving and generous and creative God and still allow this to happen? That's sort of the classic question of theodicy, and is God there? Is God not there? But to me, that is the essential spiritual quest for all Christians, is to say, how does the events of my life, where was God in the events of my life? And to me, the crucifixion really shows us how to do that. That early Christians saw this horrific event with their own eyes. They witnessed it and they felt it in their soul, especially Mary, to see her son suffering in that way. And then her reflections with the early church as she goes on and becomes a key player in the events that happen later. Even some scholars suggest that the Gospel of Luke is Mary's perspective on the life of Jesus, as she is the eyewitness to the events of his birth. As every mother is, the only one that kind of really knows what went down there. So to me, that's the essential quest of this book, is to say, how can we look at the events of our life that turned our world upside down and reflect on them theologically through this lens of trauma, so that we can get to the same place that those early disciples got to when they realized that this event of trauma, crucifixion, of death and destruction, was somehow the path to salvation, was somehow the path to a new way of living. And we can't really push that on anybody. If you ever have been with somebody that's suffering from a profound loss, and if you go up to them and say to them, this is really going to be good for you someday, I'm really excited for you that you're going to have this opportunity to theologically reflect on this in 20 years, That's sort of the Job's friends approach, although they did a good job of showing up and that sort of thing.
Because you served... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, that's it.
Because you served as an enlisted Marine and Army chaplain in Iraq, did you have to go through some of that process yourself, or with soldiers that you served very close to? And how was that healing for them? How did that connect?
I think everybody loses something in a war. You just don't know what it's going to be. And for me, it was my sense that God was good and that God loved me and was going to honor the promises that I thought God owed me because I had done certain things right and in the proper order and things like that. And that was where the wound, the spiritual wound was for me in the Iraq War. When I witnessed the horror of war on a very low level. As a combat Army chaplain, I was a non-combatant. I was an observer to the actual war. I was there to encourage the soldiers that were put in my charge to care for their spiritual lives, emotional lives, and try to connect them with the religious resources so they could practice their faith freely in a time of great conflict. And that was for every religious group you can imagine that were there in my unit. I was a Protestant chaplain in that context, but we certainly made sure they could have the tools they needed to get through this difficult experience. But in that, witnessing the horror of war, and it's not really particular horrors, but war is so brutal in that young people are empowered to kill, and that's the job, and that's what they're supposed to be doing. And when you kind of ponder the purposelessness of that and the waste of that, and even if it's for a good reason, self-defense being sort of the universally recognized reason for a war, it still is horrific and horrible. And it's huge. It's on a grand scale beyond anything I'd ever been part of. And so for me, when I came back from that, got home, my marriage fell apart. I felt like that was the sign that everything else was wrong in my life, that God had left me, God couldn't be trusted. And so here I'd been doing something that I thought was good, being there for the soldiers in their time of need, and then coming home to just untreated PTSD. That's where I was constantly hypervigilant. I couldn't sleep. I was constantly just feeling this threat all the time around me. And so in that aftermath of coming home, I really felt like God had abandoned me. And in some ways, God had, that the God that was the Santa Claus God that a lot of people have, and you can't fault us for it. We kind of teach our kids, if you do good things will happen to you. And there's a truth to that, of course. But it was when I pondered the story of Jesus through my own post-traumatic lens, now seeing the world in a very different way, and saying, Jesus did everything right, and look what happened to him. Maybe his experience is the experience of every human life that follows him. That, in fact, maybe even every human life that exists on this planet. It is in the times where we're trying our hardest to do right, often that we fail. And I thought back to a moment from the Iraq War where we were going out on a convoy one night, and I would go with the soldiers on their little trips around Baghdad and to other places just to kind of ride along and try to experience the world that they lived in to some degree. And these were very risky in the sense that that's where the risk was in Baghdad for us, was getting blown up while we drove from place to place. And I would be in the back seat, sitting there, and we'd pray before the convoy, and somebody say, "Oh, the chaplain's going with us tonight. We're going to be okay. Everything's going to be great." And I would say, the founder of my religion died 500 miles west of here, and they would all like look at me kind of funny, but actually, looking back now, that truth of the founder of my religion died 500 miles west of here. The founder of my religion died just like we might die tonight, doing something that we think is good and right here on this planet at a young age. That's actually something he experienced, and that's actually something God experienced. So that really kind of helped me put together the pieces of a shattered God, and that took years. But to say that God really, in the crucifixion and the trauma of the crucifixion, shows us that God is present in our worst experiences, but not as a aloof observer or scientific or a scientist experimenting on us or something like that, but ultimately as someone that suffers with us and that experiences everything that we've experienced, including the worst things that happen on this planet. So that's where I'm trying to help people see in the book that this is true of you as well, of all of us.
You have a tension in this book that we call the absent God and the God who is in it with us. A God who is silent. And I want to ask about that tension of, can that just feel imaginary? How you perceive that God is going through something with you, even though you don't see God. God is not carrying your pack. God is not, you don't see God wielding a sword 6 feet in front of you, whatever that might be. How is that a comfort? Because it can be a comfort for people.
Yeah, there's definitely tension in the book, and I think in life, between the God who is absent and the God who suffers with us. And I think that this tension is in the crucifixion of Jesus. My God, why have you forsaken me?" He says, quoting a psalm. Maybe he quotes the whole psalm and they just have that one line from it in the scriptures. Maybe that's the only line he can say. But what a profound, anti-God statement, or statement of feeling abandoned by God. He literally says it with his own words there on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me?" And the gospel writers say that he says this in Aramaic, in his mother tongue. So we get this sense of he's really feeling this abandonment. And here, Christians would rarely ever say that the crucifixion was an event of God abandoning Jesus or something like that, or of God not being present in a situation. And yet Christians have always kind of known that there's something happening in the crucifixion that is really horrific in the way that we understand God. And different Christians have spun off into various ways to package this. And then the other Christians accuse them of being heretics because they're saying, God can't get crucified on the cross, or God can't die, or God can't feel abandoned from God, or, all of our Trinitarian or even who Jesus is gets all muddled up on the cross, because ultimately we are experiencing the piercing of horror and trauma, which will always mess with our sense of self and who we are. Trauma victims always say this. They say things like, "I was standing outside myself, watching myself get hurt," or, "I felt like I wasn't even there. I was numb to what was happening. I felt like I was watching a movie, like it was surreal." I think for most Americans, 9/11, watching it on TV or even live, they said this over and over again. It was surreal. Surreal. What do you mean by surreal? It meant that I was viewing something with my eyes that my brain was not able to process as an actual event. So I thought I was watching a movie or something like that. The traumatic events mess with our sense of like of actual truth in a way that I think Tim O'Brien, Vietnam writer, and lives here in Texas, in Austin. He's worked on this a lot in his short story, The Things They Carried, where he talks about how time is always getting messed with in traumatic events. But and all the trauma literature says this, that you'll have memories of a traumatic event that aren't matched up with reality always, and that your brain will try to make sense of something that is nonsensical. So even in our theological reflections of what is happening on the cross, there is this propensity to commit heresy, in that people are trying to understand what Jesus is suffering, and yet every victim of trauma knows what's happening there. You don't need a theologian to help you sort out what's happening there on the cross. He's being crucified, and the God that he's prayed to, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. This God that Jesus has prayed to is not there. And that silence and the lack of intervention and the lack of love in that situation is something Jesus feels, and that we feel too. Even at the very minor inconveniences of my life, I feel this abandonment of God, that somehow, especially if I've been doing things kind of right, and I haven't been trying to make too many shortcuts and various things. These are the moments where I feel that maybe there is no God. And I think for modern people in the 20th century we're in, 2023, we live with two brains. One brain is, there is God, and God loves me. God created the world. God has a plan, some kind of plan and future. There is a future of hope that awaits us all in that glorious kingdom of light, and we look for that as Christians, and Jesus is there waiting for us. And the sort of the truths that we talk about in church all the time, like they're basic facts of the universe. And most churches that meet around America on a Sunday morning are not trying to convince everybody completely of everything they're saying. They just kind of say it like it's reality, like it's true. And then we live with this other mind, which is very materialistic and, or I mean, not in the I want to buy stuff way, but just like there is only what you can see, feel, and touch. Very nihilistic, be a good person, do your best, but it's over when you die. We are part of just this biological process that has no future ultimately, other than maybe doing some good for others and things like that. And I feel like I have those two brains all the time, and I kind of switch back and forth depending on what's happening. And I think we can see this in the crucifixion a little bit, that the reality of Jesus in that moment is God has forsaken him. And that's essentially saying there really isn't any God out there. And if there is, this God is not good. This God is not helping me. And that is a really bold and harsh thing to say. And we probably would scold our children to say it if they said it in the wrong context. And yet this is like the statement of faith from the cross that Christians have reflected on, because that's how it feels. And when someone's going through a traumatic event, we should expect that they're going to feel that something has shifted in their relationship with God, that something has been broken, something has been lost. And so the whole meaning of the resurrection is the restoration of that trust, that loss of trust, that loss of faith. So God being present with us and God being completely absent from our traumas is seen in that crucifixion scene of my God, why have you forsaken me? Both are true at the same time. And that's why Christians have always kind of, no matter what are directions of like trying to do good for the world and trying to understand other stuff in the Bible, we kind of come back to that scene on the cross a lot of times in a lot of different ways to recenter ourselves, because ultimately that's sort of the point in human history that that we look to for some sort of answer for the rest of human history.
You mentioned restoration and kind of reclaiming an identity, or maybe it's a new identity after you've been through something like that. You talk about the idea that Jesus kept his wounds and that was important and that we exist. I think in one of the places you talk about a congregation, thank you for being here with me, in the wound in the side of Jesus. Talk to me about what that means, that he kept his scars, and how that is for us as we try and establish our identity after trauma.
The knowledge that Jesus has his scars, as we say, in his hands, feet, and side, and that we know from the Gospels that he shows them to his disciples. With the encounter with Thomas, he even says, like, put your hand into my side, put your fingers through my wounds in my hand. The fact that Jesus sort of leads with that introduction and identifying marks, I always took those as being, he wants to prove that he's the same guy that got crucified, which in all fairness is part of what he's trying to do there, because they are not recognizing him in the same way, which is always true about people that have experienced traumatic events, that no one recognizes them anymore. That's the old trope about people going away to war and they come back a different person. People didn't even recognize them. And so there's definitely that going on of this is who I am. But I think there's a bigger message there too, that Jesus is saying, this is the pattern of how we're going to live in this world as my followers, in my kingdom. That the things that happen to us, the wounds of our lives, are going to be healed, and they are going to become the things that everyone can see and be thankful for and say, this is the path of life. This is how we actually save the world. This is how we give gifts to the world. This is how we bless the world through the wounds of our lives. And not that we, I said thanks for the wounds. That may be a step that not everybody's able to make or should make. Again, we don't want to tell anybody to do this. We don't want to, this is something Jesus shows us and we show other people. It is not something that we necessarily foist on other people or try to get them to do it too early. I often find as a parent that I try to push healing on my kids way too soon. When they have a disappointment or a loss, I'm trying to get them back to normal where they're not crying anymore or something like that. Whereas that impulse that I have because of my discomfort with them is really an issue with me. They need to go on their own healing journey at their pace. So Jesus showing us these wounds is a way of saying, this is how we live the human life here, following Jesus, through the power of these wounds, the power of saying, I'm vulnerable. This happened to me. This isn't the sole definition of who I am. In fact, now because of this, I'm able to love in a more deep way. And that is what Jesus does for these disciples, even the ones that denied him there when he meets with them again, and they all abandon him. He's actually able to show them even greater love through these wounds than we even saw before. And they take that love and they carry it all around the world as they are wounded themselves from these events of crucifixion. So to me, the fact, I also think that if Jesus has physical wounds that we can see in his hands and side and feet, he has other wounds too. I would assume, I'm making a big leap of assumption here, but that I don't think anyone can be crucified and not have some post-traumatic stress from that, some bodily sense of trauma, whether it's PTSD or not. I don't know. We can't diagnose historical figures with any kind of diagnosis, but to me, the lingering effects of crucifixion must be part of who he is now internally as well, just as the lingering effects of our traumatic experiences are definitely part of us, in our mind and our hearts in that way.
And I wonder if I could ask personally, thank you for that. We get little biographical notes about you sort of scattered throughout the book. I have images of a teenage door-to-door evangelical missionary, someone who enlists in the Marine Corps at age 17. Eventually, you were a chaplain. Now you're a priest. When you look back on your life, are you surprised by where you've arrived and how you've gotten there? And I wonder if that relates. You have a whole chapter, I think it's page 51, about taking up the cross, whatever that might be. I just wonder if you could talk a bit about your personal journey.
Yeah, it's been really surprising for me to think of. I just had a birthday yesterday, turned 48, and it's an age of reflection at this point. Much more ages to reflect on in the future too, but to think of that upbringing of faith in a very particular kind of American Christianity, fundamentalist Christianity, that that Jesus has stayed with me through all of these places that I've been. That the Jesus that I met when I was a child, who I knew loved me, and I knew that he loved me enough to die for me, that Jesus has been there all along. Even though I've gone through a lot of shifts and, as I've said before, loss of faith in God and anger at God and other shifts. I've switched from a fundamentalist Christian church to the Episcopal church, which is a very different experience of American and world Christianity, culturally in a lot of other ways. But really, that same Jesus has always been there.
Yeah, the same Jesus from my childhood has been with me my whole life. And now that I've gone through the experience of the Iraq War for me and the traumatic events of that, the same Jesus now has new. I have experienced Jesus in a new way. I think that's the beauty of a life of faith, is that we get to see God and see our faith in a lot of different ways, because ultimately God is beyond all human understanding on some level. And I think everybody kind of recognizes that at some point, that that Jesus, who is the human incarnation of God, who has lived here on this planet with us, ultimately can adapt to just about every situation that we might find ourselves in, so that he can love us. Ultimately, that's the purpose of any kind of adaptation and change, is so that love can flow in a more healing way. And that has helped me through these last number of years, knowing that Jesus suffered. And so whatever I'm suffering, whenever I'm feeling abandoned, alone, whenever I'm feeling that shroud of gloom that seems to descend upon him in the Garden of Gethsemane, whenever I'm feeling helpless, hopeless, worthless, all those things, that Jesus is there with me, experiencing that and there to show me love. And that's helped me through a lot of things, and I'm thankful for that. And it's the same Jesus, but Jesus looks really different now, but he always still kind of looks like me.
I think actually that's a beautiful ending there. If you're okay, I'd like to maybe ask one more question that we might edit in sooner, which is earlier in the interview, which is, as people have read this book, or as you've shared these principles with maybe it's congregation members, what response do you have?
I'm always surprised that people haven't connected their own traumatic experiences with the traumatic stuff in Jesus's life. To me, it just kind of happened intuitively, because I was desperate. I was trying to find, is this normal when I'm feeling all these weird feelings? And that death is not the end for any of us. That Jesus shows us through his death and resurrection that this pattern is the pattern that we all will be able to follow through him. That we will die on this planet, we will rise from the dead. And the little deaths we experience, these traumatic events, are also opportunities for resurrection. that kind of resurrection will happen. Never in the timing we can expect it. I imagine for those disciples, those 3 days, no matter how hard you slice them, it's hard to get the 3 days out of the gospel accounts, but 3 days is what it says. So those 3 days must have been an eternity of doubt and despair and fear. And so it is with us. It always seems like it takes a lot longer for God to work through the power of resurrection, but God always does. And so that's something I hope people can hear.
Good. David, thank you. We appreciate so much you sharing your time with us and some fascinating and important thoughts that I'm really excited for our listeners to get to hear. Thank you for speaking with me today in good faith.
Thanks for having me.